The first thing Jackson noticed was the way the hallway went quiet when he walked into it. Not silent, not empty, just quieter. Like a room that had been talking until someone important stepped inside and everyone decided at the same time to watch their words. It was a concrete corridor under a stadium, the kind built for sound to bounce. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Road cases lined the walls like black coffins, stenciled letters half scratched off from years of travel. Crew members moved fast, eyes down, clipboards tight in their hands. Somewhere deeper inside the building, a crowd was already roaring. A low, steady animal sound that leaked through the walls and shook the air. Jackson Browne carried his guitar case with one hand and kept his other hand in his jacket pocket like he could hold himself together that way. He wasn't late, he wasn't early, he was exactly when he'd been told to arrive. Still, the hallway tightened around him. A man stepped out from a door marked "Staff Only" and blocked Jackson's path like it was nothing. Mid-40s, tired face, hair combed back but already losing the fight. A laminate pass hung from his neck. His shirt was tucked in too neatly for a man who lived on buses, but his eyes were the eyes of someone who didn't sleep much. "You're Jackson," the man said. Jackson nodded. "Yeah." The man glanced behind him, then back at Jackson, like he was checking whether anyone was listening, like he was about to say something that wasn't part of the schedule. "I'm Rick," he said, tour manager. Jackson had heard the name. Everyone had. Rick was the one who made the machine move, the one who knew where every body was supposed to be at every minute, the one who could turn a problem into a solution with a phone call or make a solution disappear if it threatened the tour. Rick didn't offer his hand. He just leaned in, close enough that Jackson could smell stale coffee on his breath. "Before you go any further," Rick said quietly, "I need you to understand something." Jackson held still. The crowd sound behind the walls rose and fell like a tide. Rick's voice got lower. "You can still walk away." Jackson blinked. "What?" Rick's eyes flicked toward the hallway again. "I'm serious. Your people can call my office. We can make up a reason. We can say you're sick. We can say the flight got delayed. We can say whatever. But if you have any doubt at all, don't go into that room." Jackson looked past Rick toward the dressing room area. He could see security guards, a catering table, a cluster of people standing too close, pretending not to be close. The air smelled like hairspray and sweat and electricity. "Rick," Jackson said, careful, "I'm here to play 2 songs with him. That's it. A guest spot. It's not—" Rick cut him off, not harshly, just firmly. "That's what it looks like on paper." Jackson felt his stomach tighten. "What are you saying?" Rick's face didn't change, but his eyes did. A flash of something like regret, like he'd already tried to warn other people and watched them ignore him. "I'm saying you don't want to be in the crossfire," Rick said. "You don't want to be the calm guy in the middle of someone else's storm. You'll think you can stay neutral. You'll think it's just business, just music. But it's not. Not right now." Jackson's throat went dry. He swallowed. "Are they fighting?" Rick exhaled slowly through his nose. "They're tired. They're under pressure. Everybody's under pressure. And tired people make stupid choices. Sometimes they make them with words. Sometimes they make them with silence. Sometimes they make them in front of 10,000 people." Jackson wanted to laugh it off, wanted to say something casual, something that made this feel like a normal backstage moment, but Rick's face wouldn't allow it. Rick looked like a man trying to hold up a ceiling with his bare hands. "I appreciate the concern," Jackson said, "really, but I'm committed." Rick stared at him for a beat. Then he nodded once, like he'd expected that answer. "Okay," he said. "Then at least do this for me." "What?" Rick leaned in again. "If someone asks you to pick a side, don't. If someone tries to pull you into an argument, don't. If someone says, 'Tell him he's wrong,' don't. Keep your mouth shut. Smile. Play your songs. Walk off. And don't go anywhere alone with anybody tonight. Not because they're monsters. Because they're human. And humans do ugly things when they feel cornered." Jackson felt the weight of that settle in his chest. Then Rick stepped back, his tour manager mask sliding back into place like a curtain dropping. "They're waiting for you," Rick said, louder now like this was the official part. "Follow me." Jackson followed. The closer they got to the dressing rooms, the more the air changed. People moved around each other like water around rocks. No one touched anyone unless they had to. No one lingered longer than necessary. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was tension that had become routine. The kind that lives in a place long enough that everyone starts calling it normal. Rick stopped at a door and knocked once, not twice, not politely. The kind of knock that meant he didn't have time to be polite. A voice called out, "Yeah?" Rick opened the door and held it for Jackson. Inside, the room was too bright. Too many mirrors, too much light bouncing off white walls and shiny surfaces. A table in the center was covered with food nobody was eating. Fruit trays sweating under plastic wrap, bottles of liquor lined up like soldiers. A pile of towels on a chair. A stack of set lists. A guitar leaned against the wall like it was tired. Glenn Frey was sitting on a couch, one ankle on his knee, smiling like everything was fine. Don Henley stood near the mirror, adjusting his shirt collar, but his eyes were fixed on his own reflection, like he was trying to hold it together through willpower. Two other band members were there talking quietly, but they stopped when Jackson came in. For a second, nobody moved. Then Glenn stood up and walked over with the kind of confidence that felt like it had never failed him. "Jackson," Glenn said warmly, spreading his arms like a host welcoming a guest into a home. "You made it." Jackson smiled. "Wouldn't miss it." Glenn hugged him. It was a little too tight, a little too long, but it was still a hug, still human. Don nodded from across the room. "Hey." Jackson nodded back. "Hey." Rick stayed near the door for a moment, watching, measuring. Then he disappeared, pulling the door shut behind him. And just like that, Jackson was inside. They talked. They made small jokes. They used the old language of musicians, sound checks, keys, tempos, the safe talk that keeps everything on the surface. Glenn asked about Jackson's tour. Don asked about a song Jackson had played on the radio once, whether he'd ever finished it. The other guys offered a few comments, polite and loose. If you walked in blind, you might have thought this was normal. But Jackson felt it anyway. Under the jokes, under the warmth, something sharp and unresolved. It lived in the way Glenn and Don avoided looking at each other for too long. The way conversation shifted when one of them entered it. The way everyone laughed a half-second late, like they were checking whether it was safe to laugh. Jackson sat in a chair by the wall, guitar case at his feet, and listened more than he spoke. He remembered Rick's warning. If someone asks you to pick a side, don't. So he stayed soft, stayed quiet, let the room be what it was without trying to fix it. Then Glenn clapped his hands once. "All right, let's run the songs." He looked at Jackson. "You're good with the order we talked about?" Jackson nodded. "Yeah, same plan." Don stepped closer. "Just keep it tight." Jackson smiled slightly. "That's what I do." Don's eyes held on him for a beat too long, like he was deciding whether Jackson's confidence was real. "Good," Don said. A stage runner came in. 10 minutes. The room shifted, like a body tensing before impact. Glenn stood, rolled his shoulders. Don picked up a bottle of water and drank like he was trying to swallow down something else. Jackson stood too, lifting his guitar case. His heart was steady. He'd played bigger rooms than this. He'd been in front of crowds that could swallow you whole. The stage itself didn't scare him. It was everything under the stage that did. They walked out together through the corridor toward the stage entrance. The crowd noise grew louder, more alive. The air got cooler. The floor vibrated. At the entrance, a security guard opened a heavy door, and the sound hit Jackson like a wave. 10,000 people or more, screaming, clapping, calling out names like prayers. Glenn stepped forward first, soaking it in like sunlight. Don followed, face controlled, eyes scanning. The band went out. The lights swallowed them. Jackson stayed in the wings waiting for his cue. From there, he could see the stage, the big screens, the sea of heads, the lights sweeping across the crowd like search beams. He could also see something most people in the seats couldn't see. He could see the band's faces between moments. He could see Glenn lean toward Don to say something during a break between songs. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see Don's mouth tighten. Glenn's smile stayed, but it changed, sharper, tighter, like a blade. Don turned away and went to the microphone and spoke to the crowd, voice smooth, practiced. The crowd cheered. They loved it. They didn't hear the tension beneath it because they didn't want to. Jackson watched, felt his hands go slightly cold. 2 songs later, a stage tech leaned in. "You're up after this one." Jackson nodded. He watched Glenn and Don finish the song, heard the last chord ring out, felt the crowd erupt. Then Don walked toward the drum riser and said something to a crew member. The crew member shook his head. Don's jaw flexed. He pointed toward the side of the stage toward Jackson's position in the wings like he was indicating a problem. The crew member looked at Jackson briefly, looked away. Jackson didn't move, didn't react. He simply stood there, guitar strap in his hand, waiting like he was supposed to. The crew member hurried off. Glenn walked across the stage toward the side where Jackson waited. He moved like a man who knew every camera was on him, even when the cameras weren't. He reached the edge of the light and stepped into the shadow with Jackson. "Hey," Glenn said quickly. "We're doing it now. Same as planned." Jackson nodded. "Okay." Glenn's smile flickered. "Ignore him." Jackson didn't ask who him was. He didn't need to. Glenn clapped Jackson lightly on the shoulder, then stepped back into the light, raising his hand to the crowd. "And now," Glenn said into the microphone, voice big and bright, "we've got a friend with us tonight." The crowd roared. Glenn turned toward the wings and extended a hand like he was presenting a prize. Jackson stepped out into the light. For a moment, the noise felt like a physical force. People cheering at the sight of him, some shouting his name, some just shouting because that's what you do when a famous person appears. Jackson walked to the microphone, adjusted it slightly. He kept his face calm. He kept his shoulders loose. He refused to let the tension behind him enter his body. That was his skill. Not guitar, not voice, that ability to stay grounded when the air around you was burning. Glenn leaned in and whispered, "Take it easy." Jackson gave a small smile. Not a joke. Something else. Something private. The band hit the first chord. Jackson played. He sang. He felt the song land in the crowd the way it always did, like a shared memory. The audience moved with it. Voices rose in the chorus. For a few minutes, the tension seemed to fade under the power of something real. Then the nightmare began in a way so small most people wouldn't notice it at first. Jackson's monitor cut out. Not completely. Just enough that his own voice disappeared from his ears. The band stayed loud. The crowd stayed louder. But Jackson's internal sound, the thing he relied on to stay in time, stay in tune, stay connected, vanished. He kept singing anyway, because that's what you do. You don't panic. You don't show it. You keep your face calm, and you hold steady, and you do your job. He glanced toward the side of the stage where the monitor engineer stood. The engineer's eyes were wide, hands moving fast over a board. He shrugged helplessly. Jackson felt sweat gather under his collar. He moved closer to the main microphone, trying to catch some of his voice back through the house sound. It helped a little, not much. He played and sang through the first song, finishing on muscle memory and discipline alone. The crowd cheered. Glenn stepped forward to take the mic. "Give it up for Jackson Browne." More cheers. Jackson smiled and nodded, kept his guitar ready for the second song. Glenn leaned in again, softer now. "You good?" Jackson didn't look at him, just said quietly, "My monitor's gone." Glenn's smile faltered. "What?" "It cut out." Glenn glanced toward the side of the stage. His expression tightened. Then he smoothed it out and turned to the crowd again like nothing was wrong. They started the second song. This time, Jackson's guitar signal flickered. Just a little. A crackle. A drop, like the cable wasn't seated right, like the input was loose. But Jackson had checked his gear. His tech had checked his gear. He was not careless. He kept playing, adjusting pressure, moving the cable slightly with his foot, trying to keep the signal alive without making it obvious. The band played on. Then, halfway through the chorus, his guitar went dead. The sound vanished. Jackson's fingers kept moving for half a second out of instinct. Then he stopped. The crowd noise filled the space where his guitar should have been. Glenn looked over, still playing. His eyes flashed with something sharp. Don turned his head slightly. His face didn't change, but Jackson saw something like satisfaction buried deep enough that it could be denied. Jackson stepped back quickly. He kept his face calm. He lifted his hands in a small gesture to the crowd like, "Sorry, technical issue," and walked toward the side of the stage, away from the microphones. A stage tech rushed toward him with a spare guitar, but the strap was tangled. The tech's hands were shaking. Jackson leaned in and said, "Breathe," because it was the only useful thing he could say. He took the spare guitar, strapped it on. The band kept playing. Glenn was singing now, his voice covering the gap like a blanket thrown over a fire. Jackson stepped back toward the microphone, tested the guitar with one quick strum. It worked. He came in on the next chord like nothing had happened. The crowd cheered again, not fully understanding, just feeling the relief of sound returning. They finished the song. Jackson's heart was steady, but his hands were slightly numb, not from fear, from adrenaline held too tightly. When the last chord ended, Glenn moved to the mic. "Jackson Browne, everybody!" The crowd cheered. Jackson nodded, smiled, walked off into the wings. The moment he stepped into the shadow, Rick was there, as if he'd been waiting in the dark the whole time. Rick's face was pale. His mouth was a thin line. Jackson didn't speak first. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand. He just looked at Rick, letting the question sit there in his eyes. Rick swallowed. "You need to go to your dressing room," he said. "Now." Jackson's voice was quiet. "Was that an accident?" Rick didn't answer immediately. That was the answer. "I told you," Rick said finally, almost a whisper. "I told you to walk away." Jackson nodded once. "I need to talk to them." Rick stepped closer. "No, you don't. Not tonight. Not right now. Not while the show is still going. If you go back there, you'll be walking into a room full of heat, and you'll get burned." Jackson looked toward the corridor that led backstage. He could already hear the show continuing, the crowd screaming again as the Eagles launched into the next song. The machine was moving. It would not stop for him. "I'm not going to scream," Jackson said. "I just want to understand what happened." Rick's eyes filled with something that looked like exhaustion. "You want to understand? Okay. Here's the truth. Everybody's scared right now. Everybody's protecting their peace. They're scared of being replaced, being blamed, being seen as the weak link. When people are scared, they start making the room smaller. They start pushing out whatever feels like a threat. And tonight, for some reason, you became a threat." "I'm not a threat," Jackson said. "I know you're not," Rick replied. "But you're not the one who gets to decide what someone else feels." Jackson breathed in slowly, let the air fill his lungs, then let it out. He felt the weight of the crowd above them, the noise, the lights, the whole thing. "Did Don do it?" Jackson asked softly. Rick's jaw tightened. "Don didn't unplug her cable with his own hands, if that's what you mean. But the pressure comes from somewhere. Things happen. People make choices without signing their names." Jackson looked down his hands. They were steady again. "What do I do?" Jackson asked. Rick stared at him for a moment, and the tour manager mask dropped. Just for a second. A man beneath it. Someone who had his own fear and his own limits. "You leave," Rick said. "You walk out of this building, you get in your car, you go back to your hotel, and you do not go to the after party. You do not go to the crew hang. You do not try to talk it out tonight like everyone's reasonable, because they're not reasonable right now. They're tired and proud and cornered. And tired, proud, cornered people will do ugly things and then swear they didn't mean it." Jackson swallowed hard. "If I leave, it looks like I'm guilty." Rick shook his head. "No. If you stay, it looks like you're willing to be treated like that. If you leave, it looks like you have a spine." Jackson leaned his head back against the wall, closed his eyes for a second. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw the moment his guitar died. Saw Glenn's eyes. Saw Don's face. He opened his eyes. "I'm not trying to win a war." "I know," Rick said. "That's why you're in danger. You're a decent man in an indecent moment. Decency doesn't protect you here." Jackson turned his head toward Rick. "Why did you warn me? Really?" Rick hesitated. Then he said, "Because I watched good people get turned into stories they didn't deserve. Because I watched a mistake in a stadium become a headline, and then become a rumor, and then become a label that follows you. Because I watched men destroy each other over nothing that mattered in the end. And I didn't want you to be one more body on the side of the road." Jackson stared at him. The honesty in Rick's voice was not dramatic. It was tired. That made it worse. From the stage, the Eagles had a familiar intro. The crowd erupted again. The show was moving forward like a train that didn't care who fell off. Jackson stood up straight. "I'm leaving." Rick nodded, relief flickering across his face. "Good." Jackson paused. "But I need my guitar." Rick waved at a tech. "Get his gear, now." As the tech ran off, Rick leaned in one last time. "And Jackson, yeah, if anyone asks tomorrow, you had a great time. You're grateful. You love those guys. You don't know what happened. You don't have an opinion. You don't have an opinion. You don't make this bigger than it is." Jackson looked at him. "That's lying." Rick's expression tightened. "No, it's survival." Jackson didn't argue, he just nodded. He walked through the corridor away from the stage, away from the lights, away from the sound. The further he got, the quieter it became. The stadium felt like a living thing behind him, roaring, feeding on itself. In the parking lot, the air was cooler. The night had teeth. Jackson stood near a row of trucks waiting for his guitar case. He could see the tour buses lined up like sleeping animals. He could see crew members smoking, laughing too loudly, their voices carrying into the night. A van door slid open. Someone inside called out Glenn's name. Laughter. Jackson stayed in the shadows. The tech returned with his guitar. Breathless. "Here. Sorry, man. I don't know what—" "It's okay," Jackson said. He meant it in a strange way. It wasn't the tech's fault. It was never the tech's fault when something bigger was happening. The tech looked like he wanted to say more, like he wanted to apologize for the universe, but he just nodded and walked away. Jackson got into his car. He sat behind the wheel for a long time without turning the key. The stadium noise was muffled now, but still present, like thunder in the distance. He thought about going back inside, thought about walking into the dressing room, looking Glenn and Don in the eyes, asking the question straight. "Did you do this?" But what would that accomplish? If they said no, he'd never believe it. If they said yes, it wouldn't change the fact that it had happened. And if they said some version of "things got out of hand, you were in the wrong place at the wrong time," then what? He would be left holding anger he didn't know where to put. He started the car and drove out of the lot. On the freeway, the city lights stretched out, blurred by the windshield. The radio was on low. He didn't change the station. He let it play whatever it played, like his hands needed to be busy with driving, not with choosing. At the hotel, he went up to his room alone. The hallway was quiet, carpeted, with the kind of soft lighting meant to make everything feel safe. He unlocked the door and stepped inside and shut it behind him. He put his guitar case on the floor by the bed, sat down on the edge of the mattress. The room smelled like detergent and stale air conditioning. He waited for the anger to come, or the fear, or the humiliation, something big. Instead, he felt something worse. He felt small, not as a person, as an object, like a piece in someone else's machine, brought in when useful, discarded when inconvenient. He thought about the crowd cheering, not knowing his guitar had died on purpose, not knowing anything about what was happening below the stage. He thought about how easy it would be for tomorrow's story to become. Jackson Browne had technical problems and left early. Jackson Browne was difficult. Jackson Browne couldn't hang with the Eagles. He thought about Rick's words. A mistake in the stadium becomes a headline, then a rumor, then a label. He laid back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. He didn't sleep much. The next morning, the phone rang at 9. Jackson sat up, hard jumping like he'd been hit. He answered. It was Glenn. "Hey," Glenn said. His voice was warm, casual, too casual. Jackson's throat tightened. "Hey." Glenn laughed lightly. "Man, what happened with your gear last night? That was crazy." Jackson sat very still. "Yeah, crazy." "I'm sorry, buddy," Glenn said. "You know how it is. Big stage, 1,000 moving parts. Stuff happens." Jackson didn't speak. Glenn kept going, filling the silence. "But you were great. Crowd loved you. Don said you handled it like a pro." Jackson felt a cold wave move through him at the mention of Don. Don said, "Listen," Glenn continued, "we're doing a crew thing tonight. You should come. No hard feelings. Just a good hang." Jackson closed his eyes. Rick's face flashed in his mind. Tired, proud, cornered people will do ugly things. He opened his eyes, looked at his guitar case on the floor. "I can't," Jackson said quietly. "What?" Glenn sounded surprised, like the word didn't compute. "Why not?" "I've got to get back on the road," Jackson said. "My schedule." There was a pause, a small one. But Jackson heard it. The slight shift. The recalculation. "Ah," Glenn said. "Okay. Yeah. Of course. You're busy." Another pause. Then Glenn's voice softened. "But not in a good way. You're not mad, are you?" Jackson held the phone tighter. He could feel the trap in the question. If he said yes, he became dramatic. If he said no, he swallowed it. He chose the third option, the one that was true. "I'm tired," Jackson said, "and I didn't like losing my sound on stage." Glenn laughed again, but the laugh was thinner. "Nobody liked it, trust me." Jackson waited. Glenn's voice lowered slightly. "Look, man, I don't know what you think happened, but whatever it is, don't turn it into a thing. Don't let people get in your ear. This tour is already, it's already a lot." Jackson's stomach twisted. There it was. The warning, disguised as concern. Don't turn it into a thing. Don't let people get in your ear. Like Jackson hadn't felt what he felt. Like his experience was something he could be talked out of. "Okay," Jackson said. Glenn exhaled, relieved. "Good. All right, I'll see you around." They hung up. Jackson sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in his hand. The room was quiet. He could hear distant traffic outside. A housekeeping cart rolling down the hallway. He thought about the after-party, about how Glenn had wanted him there, not because Glenn missed him, because Glenn wanted control of the story, wanted to make sure Jackson didn't walk into a room where someone else would tell him something he didn't want him to hear. He thought about Don, about his face on stage, about that faint satisfaction he might have imagined, might have created in his own mind. He couldn't prove any of it. That was the worst part. He was left with feelings and no evidence, and feelings in this business were treated like weakness. He packed his bag and checked out. On the drive out of town, he passed the stadium. In daylight, it looked harmless, a big shell of concrete and steel. No hint of what it held the night before. He kept driving. Over the next weeks, the story moved on without him. The Eagles kept touring. The press kept writing. The machine kept working. Jackson went back to his own shows, his own songs, his own smaller world where he could hear himself on stage and didn't have to look over his shoulder in the wings. But the night didn't disappear. It stayed in him in small ways. In the way he checked his gear twice before every show, in the way he watched faces more carefully when someone smiled too wide, in the way he flinched when a monitor crackled. It also stayed in him in a deeper way, in the quiet question that returned late at night when he was alone with his guitar. How much of your peace can you trade for belonging? He tried not to think about it, tried to let the thing be what it was, an ugly night, a technical mess, a misunderstanding, a moment that didn't deserve to become a scar. But scars don't ask permission. Months later, he ran into Rick at an airport. Rick was standing near a gate with a coffee in his hand, looking like he'd aged 5 years in one season. He saw Jackson and froze. like he wasn't sure if Jackson would want to speak to him. Jackson walked over anyway. Rick's face softened. "Hey, hey," Jackson said. They stood there, the noise of the airport moving around them, announcements overhead, suitcases rolling by, people living their lives. Rick looked down at his coffee. "You okay?" Jackson nodded. "Yeah." Rick's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry." Jackson shook his head. "You warned me." Rick looked up, his eyes were tired. "Yeah, and you didn't listen." Jackson let a breath out. "No, I didn't." Rick hesitated. Then he said very quietly, "It wasn't about you." Jackson stared at him. Rick's voice stayed low. That's what people won't understand. They'll think it was personal, like you did something, like you deserved it. But it wasn't about you. You were just there, a symbol, a piece of heat in an already hot room. And sometimes the room needs someone to blame just so the people inside it can breathe. Jackson swallowed. "So who did it?" Rick looked away. "You know I can't answer that." Jackson nodded. "Yeah." Rick leaned in a little like he couldn't help himself. "But I can tell you this, the people you think are winning in those moments, they're not winning, they're surviving. And survival can look like power from the outside, but from the inside, it's just fear." Jackson held Rick's gaze. For the first time, he saw what Rick had been carrying. Not allegiance, not strategy, just the constant pressure of keeping the machine moving while the people inside it broke each other apart. "I don't hate them," Jackson said. Rick's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "I know you don't. That's why I liked you." Jackson looked down. Then, back up. "Do you ever wish you'd walked away?" Rick's face went still. The question hit something honest. "Every day," Rick said, "and then I wake up and do it again." They stood there in silence, letting that truth sit between them. Finally, Rick straightened. The tour manager mask slid back into place. "You take care of yourself, Jackson." "You too." Rick nodded once and walked away. Jackson watched him go, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for what that world did to people. Relief that he was no longer inside it. He boarded his flight, sat by the window, watched the plane lift off and the city shrink into a grid of lights and lines. Somewhere down there, tours were still moving. People were still playing to crowds, still chasing the same thing, still stepping into rooms that were too hot and too full of fear. Jackson rested his head against the window and closed his eyes. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel like he'd learned something clean. He didn't feel like there was a clear ending to any of it. He just felt older, quieter inside, like a part of him had accepted something he'd resisted for a long time, that sometimes a warning isn't meant to scare you. It's meant to save you from becoming a story you never chose. And the hardest part wasn't that Rick had been right. The hardest part was that Jackson could still remember the moment in the hallway when Rick said, "You can still walk away," and how Jackson had thought, "It's only 2 songs," as if a person could step into a storm for only 2 songs and come out dry. The plane moved through clouds. Sunlight flashed and vanished. The engine hum stayed steady. Jackson opened his eyes and looked out at the bright air. He thought about the next show. His show. His show. His stage. His sound. He thought about the way he'd held his face calm when his monitor died. The way he'd told the tech to breathe. The way he'd kept singing anyway. Not heroic, just professional, just human. He thought about how little anyone in the crowd had known and how much that didn't matter, because he had known, Rick had known, and in the end, that was the only truth he could carry. He leaned back in his seat and let the plane take him away from the stadium, away from the backstage corridors, away from the bright dressing rooms and the silent wars. Not because he was better than them, because he was tired of being in rooms where fear pretended to be power, and because he finally understood what Rick meant. He should have listened.